Today's lecture is about oriented listening, and you can find this in chapter 3 of your textbook. So if you've read this, then you probably have a good idea of what I'm talking about when I say oriented listeners. But I depart from the book a little bit when I say that we usually fall into a certain category. One of these oriented listening styles we do more than the others. It's kind of our default go-to style. So I want to go into some more detail and give you an example of some of these listening orientations. The first one is the time-oriented listener. Time-oriented listeners are trying to listen for the shortest time available. Usually they want to get in and get out, no fuss, no muss, get it over with, and then go on with their day. I would count my dad as a time-oriented listener. My dad's not usually thought of as a great listener. In fact, when I was growing up, I used to think it was so rude because he would tell my mom this when she was talking. And this meant land the plane. Like, stop circling the subject, just land the plane. I got really frustrated with that. Normally, if you fall into the time-oriented listener category more often than any of the others, then people don't consider you a good listener. Time-oriented listeners want to know right up front how much time this is going to take. How much of their precious time are you going to use up in this conversation? So they can come off as kind of rude and cold. Next time level up is the action-oriented listener. Action-oriented listeners are willing to give you more time if they can see the point to it. They're goal-oriented listeners. That's another way to put it. They're listening to accomplish some kind of goal. They want to know the who, what, when, where, why as quickly as possible, usually, but so that they know what to do with that piece of information once they have it. I can kind of see where my dad's coming from, though, because my mom has given me a grocery list before. And that grocery list was done over the phone while I was at the grocery store and she was at home getting ready for a party. And so I would call and say something like, "Mom, what do I need to get?" And she would say, "Oh, don't forget a dozen eggs. I saw a thing in the paper. Maybe it was at Kroger or maybe it was at H-E-B. I don't remember. But eggs were only 86 cents a dozen. When I was younger, they used to be this and this and this." And then it was the same story with the sugar. She would talk about how much sugar was when she was a kid. Or that she knows that they moved it. It was on a different aisle, but then they remodeled the store. Oh my goodness, at that point I was yelling for my mom, "Just get to the point. What do I need to get?" I was an action-oriented listener. I wanted to know what items I needed and how I could get out of the store in the least amount of time possible. Content-oriented listener is next. Moves up a notch even more. Content-oriented listeners, they kind of want all the relevant information because they like to be their own editors, which means that they don't want anybody cutting out information that they might need before it gets to them. They want to hear everything and then decide what's necessary. Sometimes content-oriented listeners are accused of listening to trap. So in other words, I want all the information so that I can get all the clues I need to figure out what's going on here. Detectives are content-oriented listeners. Content-oriented listeners also don't have necessarily a time frame on their conversation as long as they can get all the pieces together and then make their own decisions. Normally, I consider myself a content-oriented listener. I really like to make those connections for myself. I don't like pre-edited messages from others. And I'll ask a lot of questions that they may seem to think is irrelevant, but it's important to me. It paints the picture for me. People-oriented listeners are the last ones we're going to talk about. People-oriented listeners listen for emotions. They want to know how people are interacting and what type of emotions are going on with that person. Sometimes people-oriented listeners and empathic listeners come to overlap. They're the same thing. So with people-oriented listeners, though, not every people-oriented listener is a gossip, but every gossip is a people-oriented listener. It's because what they're listening for is that interaction between humans, that human soap opera going on. And they want to know, how did that person react? What did they think? What did they feel? But it can also mean sharing in someone's grief or joy or happiness. That also makes a person a people-oriented listener. There's situational times when you might need to be a more time-oriented listener or a more action-oriented listener or a more people-oriented listener. If your best friend has just lost their job and they want to talk to you about it, at that point, you probably need to be a people-oriented listener rather than a time-oriented listener. However, if the building were on fire and we all needed to get out, then maybe being a time-oriented listener or an action-oriented listener would come in really handy. Okay, so there you have it, a little more depth on Chapter 3's people, time, action, and content-oriented listening. If you have any questions, feel free to contact me. Thanks.